Hello, my friends, and welcome to yet another episode of 30 Albums for 30 Years, 1964 till 1994. I am your host, Jay Sweet. In this podcast, we take a look and a listen to the 30 most impactful albums between those years, 64 to 94, and that's 30 albums per year, and I do it chronologically. So that's a whole lot of albums. Hopefully, I last that long. I do pre-record these podcasts. Today is actually February 4th, and I would like to mention that we've added 2 new countries of listeners. We have now listeners in Sweden and Germany, so welcome. That's exciting for me. And without further ado, let's get into it. The Dave Clark 5, Glad All Over, Columbia Records, released sometime of March of 1964. All right, cats, so let's learn a little bit about the Dave Clark 5, the DC-5. They are one of the most overlooked of the impactful British invasion bands, which is surprising when you consider that they were once the Beatles' most competitive rivals, charting 17 top 40 hits from 1964 till 1967, and selling over 100 million records during an 8-year run. The group started out in London in 1958, under the leadership of drummer and songwriter Dave Clark. The original recording lineup included founding members such as Rick Huxley on bass, Lenny Davidson on lead guitar, Dennis Payton on saxophone, he also played some harmonica and guitar, Mike Smith on lead vocals, he also played some keyboards, and Dave Clark on the drums and backup vocals. Now, in addition to being a solid drummer, Dave Clark was also a shrewd and forward-looking businessman who retained ownership of all of the band's publishing and masters, so he made quite a bit of money off of the music of the Dave Clark 5. By 1962, DC-5 found local fame by playing in English pubs and for U.S. troops stationed in England. In September 1963, the group released its first hit, a cover of the Contours' Do You Love Me? In January of 1964, the band came to more notoriety by releasing original singles such as Glad All Over. And they were indeed glad all over when the song eventually knocked the Beatles' I Want to Hold Your Hand off the number 1 position on the UK charts and reached as high as number 6 on the US Billboard charts. All right, so let's get into the album. In March of 1964, the Dave Clark 5 released their debut album, Glad All Over. The song contained the title track, and to support the album, the band was invited to perform on The Ed Sullivan Show not long after the Beatles made their celebrated debut on the program. The Dave Clark 5 appeared on the program 18 times. That's more than any other rock band. And by 1965, the band was flying high. They were the first rockers to have a private plane. In response to the Beatles' film A Hard Day's Night, the Dave Clark 5 released their own film, Having a Wild Weekend. It's also called Catch Us If You Can in England, and it was produced by Warner Brothers. Now, throughout their history, which ended in 1970, the Dave Clark 5 continued to look to catch the Beatles, and they came close with an incredible string of hits in both the US, 17 hits, and in England they had 12. Then, 1967, things began to change. Many of the British bands like the Beatles started to move towards a more psychedelic rock sound, and the Dave Clark 5 did not adapt. In fact, in the US, their popularity basically ended in 1967. Now, for a few more years, they stayed popular in England, but decided to call it quits in 1970, at which point an offshoot group called Dave Clark and Friends, which included founding members Clark and Smith, they formed, and they lasted until 1972. Unlike most British invasion bands, the group stayed inactive. Dave Clark held the group's music from being re-released between 1978 and 1993. And in the meantime, Dave Clark continued successful business efforts, often centered around his media company and the ownership of the famous British pop rock television show Ready, Steady, Go, of which he acquired the rights. Okay, so it's time to drop the needle on the record and listen to Side 1, Track 1, Glad All Over. Don't you wish you felt glad all over? I mean, that's pretty glad. I know I do. That would be pretty cool. Not sure I ever felt glad all over. Anyway, let me get back into this. So Glad All Over was the group's first major hit, charting at number 1 in the UK and number 6 in the US, and it sold over 1 million singles worldwide, 1 million copies worldwide. The song was written by singer Mike Smith and Dave Clark, and the tune exemplifies the Mersey beat sound. That's a sound that was developed in Liverpool, which is basically a blend of American rhythm and blues, skiffle music, and pop music. The track is an overmodulated rocker in which the narrator confidently tells his love that she will be glad all over. He's very confident in his skills, I suppose. And then the song adds a typical call and response between Smith and the rest of the band singing backing vocals. The recording has a noticeable key change on the bridge, which happens twice. Could have been done a little more smoothly, I think. Smith's vocals on the track are pretty in your face, and the tune is kind of heavy for its time. And while you certainly can hear similarities between the DC-5 and the Beatles, the usage of saxophone Dennis Payton does give the Dave Clark 5 a more specific sound, separating their sound from the Beatles, I believe. So nonetheless, let's go ahead, let's listen, let's all feel glad all over. Track number 2 is All of the Time. The song has a driving beat and a characteristic saxophone figure. The solo section is unique as well, as the bass and the guitar play a unison solo line, and rarely is the bass featured like this in early rock and roll. There's also sort of this unique sliding guitar figure that drops in and out, and it sounds to me like a lap steel guitar. All of the Time is a solid album cut that I would listen to only some of the time. This next track is a popular ballad that was first written and recorded by Maurice Williams from the doo-wop group The Zodiacs, and the name of the track is Stay. There are much better versions than this. Check out the Hollies, the Four Seasons, Jackson Browne, but it's not so bad that I won't stay to the end. Check it out, Dave Clark 5's version of Stay. This next track is Chaquita. Chaquita is an instrumental based on the song Tequila, which was recorded by the group The Champs. The song is an obvious filler, but I dig the percussive groove, Payton's overblown sax line, and Davidson's guitar work. A track like this is far removed from anything the Beatles would release, and it does help to separate the two groups. Chaquita. At this point of the podcast, I ask you the very important question, do you love me? Well, if you do, you can check us out on Facebook, on Instagram, 30 Albums for 30 Years, and also you can reach out to me through our website, 30albumsfor30years.com. But really, do you love me is the final track of side 1, and it's a popular R&B number written by Motown's founder Barry Gordy. The Contours first made the song a hit in 1962, and the DC-5's version was released in 1963 and became their first charting single at number 11. Like most British invasion bands, the DC-5 does a pretty good job at being a cover band. All right, time to flip the record and drop the needle on side 2, and track 1 of side 2 is Bits and Pieces. Bits and Pieces was the second mega hit from the record, reaching as high as number 4 on the US Billboard charts. The song is another call and response bass tune. Mike Smith, who co-wrote the tune with Dave Clark, sings the piece passionately. The drum beat is heavy, and the song includes some drum breaks, giving Dave Clark his moment on the record. Now, I must admit the key change on the bridge and the ending are somewhat sloppily handled. The Dave Clark 5 at times weren't the smoothest band. Now, also take notice of the hand claps and the tambourine, which borrows from the heavy percussive elements that became associated with the Motown sound. There are bits and pieces that I like from the piece. Please enjoy Bits and Pieces. Track number 2 of side 2 is I Know You Know. And what you might not know was that initially the song was the B-side to the hit Glad All Over. The song is a statement in which the narrator knows he is no longer loved by his woman. The song has a similar feel to Glad All Over, and it is a good comparison piece. Track number 4 of the original LP is the song Doodah. Doodah is based on the Disney tune Zippity Doodah. Now, every band has some embarrassing moments, but this one might take the cake. I mean, what were they thinking with this track? And Dave Clark must have realized it was terrible because he left it off the reissue versions of the album. The 5th track of side 2 on the original LP is the song Time. Time is a solid and somewhat quirky jazzy instrumental. And like the song Chiquita, these instrumental tracks give the DC-5 a different personality from other British invasion bands who relied more heavily on the blues. The tune shows a strong level of musicianship and a degree of creativity, and Time is worthy of your time. The 3rd track on the original LP, side 2, is No Time to Lose. The song is basically a version of Twist and Shout with different lyrics, and it was left off of the reissue record and is not currently on Spotify, probably because Dave Clark realized it's not very good. But if you're a completist like me, you can go to YouTube and check it out. If you have no time to lose, then skip this one and go to the next track. The final track on the original LP is She's All Mine, a driving Dave Clark original and an acceptable album cut, but not really the group's best work, and therefore it was left off of the reissue. The song is not currently available on Spotify, so if you want to hear it, it may be back to YouTube for you. Now, later in the year, the group released a follow-up called Can't You See That She's Mine? That was a top 10 hit. That song can be heard on the group's follow-up record, The Dave Clark 5 Return. which was released in June of 1964. That album did not make our top 30, so if you're Glad All Over from the Dave Clark 5, you will want to check that out. All right, my friends, we did it. We made it to the end of the album, and we are better for it. So now it's time to lift the needle off of the record, put the record back into its cover, and slip that cover back onto the shelf. In conclusion, Glad All Over is a solid first showing from a once incredibly popular band. In fact, at the time, as I mentioned, the group was the biggest threat to the Beatles' early supremacy. The Beatles eventually left the Dave Clark 5 in the dust, and now most people have forgotten about the group. But they were significant for the time, and even if the record doesn't make you feel glad all over, I hope that you are at least somewhat pleased. All right, thanks for sticking around for the J Plays section, the bonus section, where I take a tune from the record and I reinterpret it through a home recording, not high production value stuff, just something I do at home on my computer, a little fun little project. So the obvious choice for this record was Glad All Over, and that's the tune I chose to present, and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks for listening.